I stood alone in the glowing ballroom of the Lakewood Hotel in Seattle, staring at 3 empty chairs in the front row. Each bore a small silver card reading "Reserved for Family." The candlelight shimmered against the crystal vases and white roses, but all I could feel was the hollow ache in my chest. The quartet began to play softly, something classical, something beautiful, and yet the music sounded like a funeral dirge in my ears. "My wedding planner," her voice gentle, whispered. "It's time, Maddie." I nodded even as my throat burned. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, I was walking down the aisle alone, every eye in the room silently, asking the question I was trying so hard not to answer. Where were they? My mother, my father, my brother Daniel, none of them had come. Not one message, not one call, just absence dressed up as indifference. The doors opened, and I stepped forward, bouquet trembling slightly in my hands. 90 faces turned toward me, the guests murmuring softly. Some smiled out of sympathy, others exchanged pitying glances that stung worse than any insult. I kept my eyes on Evan at the altar, the only person whose gaze didn't make me feel like a tragic headline. His expression was steady, proud, filled with the kind of love that anchors you when the rest of the world drifts away. When I reached him, he took my hand and whispered, "You're not alone anymore." It was a promise, simple and solid. I clung to it as the minister began to speak. But while the vows filled the air, my mind drifted backward to the last call I had with my mother 3 days before the ceremony. I could still hear her voice, calm and clipped. "Sweetheart, your brother's firm has a fundraiser that weekend. We'll try to make it if we can. Try." As if attending their only daughter's wedding were a favor to pencil into their schedule. "I'll pay for your flights," I'd begged, swallowing pride that had taken years to build. "The hotel too, whatever you need." "Please, Mom." Silence. Then my father's voice in the background, muffled but distinct. "Tell her we're busy." And then the line had gone dead. I remember sitting on the couch that night, staring at the engagement photo on my phone. Evan and I were laughing, caught mid-spin in a field of wildflowers outside the city. It was everything love should look like: joyful, equal, real. I wondered if my parents would ever see that version of me, the one who wasn't a disappointment or a shadow behind Daniel's spotlight. They'd raised him to believe he was destined for greatness, a future lawyer, the pride of the family. And maybe he was. But somewhere along the way, they decided there was room for only one success story in our house. When I was 12, Daniel won the state debate championship. My parents threw a party complete with a banner and catered sandwiches. Guests filled our living room clapping as my father toasted to the next great heart legacy. My art award certificate sat on the kitchen counter, untouched, curling slightly at the edges. I tried to show it to them earlier, explaining how my teacher said I had extraordinary potential. My mother had smiled absently and said, "That's nice, honey," before turning back to arrange the cheese platter. Later, Dad had ruffled my hair. "Daniel needs more of our attention right now. You understand, don't you, Maddie?" And of course I'd nodded. That's what good daughters do. They understand. Even when it hurts. The ceremony moved forward in a blur. I heard myself reciting vows promising love, respect, and partnership. But underneath the words, another silent vow formed: I would never let myself beg for their approval again. I would build a life so undeniable that even their indifference couldn't erase me. When I said I choose to build a family who sees me, I meant every word. Evan squeezed my hand as if he knew the layers hidden in that sentence. After the kiss and applause, the reception began. Champagne poured, laughter echoed, and the photographer captured smiles that looked almost real. I danced with Evan under strings of golden lights, while guests cheered, but my eyes kept flicking toward those 3 empty chairs. Every now and then someone would murmur, "Such a shame her parents couldn't make it." I'd smile tightly, the way people do when they're trying not to bleed in public. My closest friend Nina tried to distract me. "Ignore them, Mads. You've got everything you need right here." She gestured toward the crowd of Evan's relatives, warm, loud, affectionate. People who had hugged me like I belonged from the moment I walked into their lives. Still, when I slipped outside later for a breath of air, the silence hit me like a wave. The city's skyline glimmered beyond the garden terrace. I scrolled through my phone out of habit. No messages, not even a text saying congratulations. I told myself I was done caring, but the sting wouldn't fade. I thought about every moment I'd tried to make them proud. The scholarships, the internships, the tech competition I'd won in college. Each milestone had been met with polite nods and phrases like, "That's practical, dear." But when Daniel made partner at his law firm, they posted about it on Facebook for a week straight. I was lost in that thought when a woman's voice startled me. "Beautiful wedding," she said. I turned to see a tall woman in her 40s, elegant in a navy dress. Her tone carried the calm authority of someone used to being listened to. "Thank you," I murmured, unsure who she was. "Joanna Lee," she introduced herself. "I'm a friend of Evan's producer. I couldn't help noticing you're quite the force up there." I laughed softly. "A force, more like a nervous wreck." Joanna's smile deepened. "No. I saw how you stood alone at the altar and still held your head high. That's not weakness, Maddie, that's power. Sometimes the people who don't show up are doing you a favor." Her words sank deep, though I didn't fully understand them then. We spoke briefly small talk about Seattle's unpredictable weather, her work in venture capital, how she admired Evan's creative career. But something in her tone lingered after she walked away like a promise of future significance. I looked back at the ballroom through the glass doors. Evan was laughing with his friend's champagne flute in hand. The band had started playing our song. For the first time that night, I didn't feel invisible. I felt awake. When I stepped back inside, the applause erupted as Evan twirled me across the floor. My dress shimmered under the lights, the music rising in waves around us. The pain was still there, tucked beneath the joy, but it no longer defined me. As the night wore on, I realized something unexpected. Maybe those empty seats weren't symbols of rejection anymore. Maybe they were space room for something new to grow. Later, as the guests clinked glasses and the laughter softened into a lull, I found myself whispering under my breath, "They'll see me someday." I didn't mean it as a threat, but as a promise to myself. I didn't know then how soon that promise would come true, how far I'd rise, or how the same people who ignored me today would one day call begging for help. I only knew one thing for certain: that empty row was the beginning of everything. The city woke under a gray Seattle morning mist, curling along the skyline like memory refusing to fade. My coffee sat untouched beside my laptop as I scanned through investor updates and team messages. Numbers filled the screen: contracts, profit margins, potential partnerships, all the markers of a thriving business. But none of it quieted the hollow rhythm beneath my ribs. 2 years into LumoSync's success, and still some part of me waited for a text that would never come. My parents had missed every milestone: the product launch, the first office opening, the Forbes feature. I told myself I didn't care. But sometimes when the day got quiet, I'd catch myself checking my phone like a reflex. That morning, Joanna Lee walked into my office, her sharp heels tapping against the marble floor. "Madeline," she said, "you need to breathe. The contract with Vertex is done. You've built something worth celebrating." I smiled faintly. "We'll celebrate after the integration is live." She folded her arms. "You keep saying that. You realize you've been saying that for 5 years." I leaned back, rubbing my temples. "Maybe I don't know how to stop." Joanna tilted her head. "Then learn. Success without rest isn't strength, it's survival." Her words lingered after she left. For a moment, I stared at the reflection in the glass wall, the crisp suit, the controlled posture, the woman who had built an empire from scratch. She looked composed, untouchable. But inside, I knew the truth: everything I'd built was armor. By noon, Evan called. "Lunch?" he asked. I hesitated. "Can we make it quick?" His laugh echoed through the speaker. "You say that every time, and it never is." We met at our usual spot, a small cafe tucked between office towers, quiet enough to talk, warm enough to feel human again. Evan was already at the table when I arrived, 2 sandwiches waiting. He looked up and grinned. "You've been glued to your laptop again." "I'm running a company," I said, sitting down. "You're running yourself into the ground," he countered. "There's a difference." He wasn't wrong. I took a slow sip of coffee. "I just want to keep the momentum. Maddie," he said softly, "you've already proved yourself. The people who needed to see it still won't." The words hit harder than I expected. "You mean my parents?" He gave me a look, gentle but knowing. "They haven't called, have they?" "Not once," I said, forcing a shrug. "It's fine. Is it?" I opened my mouth to answer but stopped when my phone buzzed. For a moment, hope flickered, irrational, unwanted, before I saw the screen. Unknown number. Probably spam. Still, my heart skipped as I silenced it. "Not them," I said, managing a smile. Evan reached across the table, his hand brushing mine. "One day that won't matter. One day you'll stop waiting." When I got back to the office, the LumoSync logo gleamed across the lobby walls, silver, modern, confident. My assistant handed me a tablet. Miss Hart Forbes requested an update for their Under 40 Innovators feature. They'd like to film next month. "Schedule it," I said automatically. But as I stepped into the elevator, a strange fatigue settled over me. All the recognition, all the success, it filled rooms, but never the empty space inside me. That evening, I drove home as twilight bled across the city. The Porsche's interior glowed softly, its hum steady beneath my fingertips. Somewhere between the traffic lights, I caught my own reflection in the window, the same look I'd worn years ago on my wedding day. Alone, poised, pretending it didn't hurt. At home, Evan had dinner waiting. Candlelight flickered across the table, reflecting off 2 glasses of wine. "You're late," he teased, but his smile didn't hide the concern. I lost track of time. "You always do." He reached across the table, fingers brushing mine. "I read that article they did on you, the one calling you Seattle's silent powerhouse." "You know what word stood out?" I raised an eyebrow. "Silent." He nodded. "You don't have to be. You've built something extraordinary. You can allow yourself to be proud." "I am proud," I said, but my voice sounded uncertain even to me. "Then why does it feel like you're still chasing something?" I looked down at my glass, the crimson reflection of candlelight rippling across the surface. "Because I am," I whispered, "and I don't even know what anymore." He didn't push further, just took my hand in his. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, it was understanding. The kind born from years of watching me run toward success as if it could fill the holes left by love. When the dishes were cleared and the candles burned low, Evan found me on the balcony, leaning against the railing, staring out at the city lights. "You ever wonder," I said quietly, "if people like us build so much just to prove to someone we're worth noticing?" He slipped his arms around me from behind. "Maybe at first, but eventually it stops being about them." "I'm not there yet." "Then keep building until you are." His words stayed with me through the night. 2 days later, LumoSync's acquisition offer came through, a deal worth $21 million. The kind of number that changes lives, secures futures, proves everything. The team celebrated with champagne and music. Cameras flashed, people cheered. Joanna raised her glass. "To Madeline Hart," she said, "the woman who built something from nothing." Everyone applauded. But even in that noise, I felt a quiet distance from it all, like I was watching someone else's triumph from the outside. When the party ended, I sat alone in my office, the city lights flickering against the glass walls. My phone buzzed, another notification, another article, another congratulation, then another buzz, this time different. A social media alert. I opened it. Logan Hart tagged in a post. My brother? The photo showed my parents, Logan and his wife, at a school fundraiser, their twins in matching uniforms. The caption read, "3 generations of excellence. Family first." There it was again, the perfect portrait. My parents beaming with pride beside the son they'd always called the future. No mention of me, not a single trace. I stared at the screen until the image blurred. Then I laughed, a small breathless sound that felt like breaking and release all at once. "Family first," I whispered. "Just not this family." When Joanna stopped by the next morning, she found me sitting at my desk, calm but distant. "You look like you've made a decision," she said. "I have." She waited. "I'm done chasing people who never looked back," I said. "It's time to invest in the ones who show up." Joanna smiled, her eyes warm. Now that she said is power, that afternoon I called my financial advisor. "Transfer the funds," I said. "All 16 million. The LumoSync Women in Tech Foundation launches next quarter." The line went silent. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Completely." When I hung up, I exhaled slowly, the weight of years lifting from my shoulders. For the first time, my success wasn't about proving anything. It was about creating something. Outside rain began to fall, soft, steady, familiar. I watched it streak down the glass, blurring the city below. It wasn't the sound of loneliness anymore. It was the sound of beginning. The morning the LumoSync deal was finalized, the sky above Seattle stretched pale blue, cloudless, impossibly still. I stood at the window of my office, holding a glass of water that had gone warm in my hand. Down below, traffic pulsed through the streets, 1,000 stories rushing somewhere important. I tried to feel the triumph that should have come with this moment. $21 million. A lifetime of validation, contracts, headlines, success. But all I felt was silence. Joanna entered, phone pressed to her ear, her sharp strides slicing through my thoughts. "They've confirmed," she said, ending the call. "Everything's cleared. The acquisition is official." "Good," I said, my voice flat. "Good." She set the phone on my desk. "Madeline, do you even hear yourself? This is your moment. You've done something most people only dream about." I turned from the window and forced a smile. "Then, let's call it a good day." Joanna studied me, her expression softening. "You're allowed to enjoy it, you know." "I will," I said, "eventually." When she left, I sat down and opened my laptop. A flood of congratulations filled my inbox. Investors, journalists, old classmates who'd ignored me for years suddenly remembering my name. "Proud of you, Maddie. Always knew you'd make it big." Lies typed in bright fonts. I scrolled through them until I saw one unread message buried among the noise. From Evan, "Dinner tonight. No excuses. We're celebrating this even if I have to drag you." I smiled despite myself. That night he greeted me at the door with a half-burned candle and a bottle of wine. "Don't look at me like that," he said, laughing as he waved the corkscrew. "You can't build an empire and then eat instant ramen." "I've done it before." "Exactly. And that's why tonight you won't." He served pasta, perfectly over-seasoned, and poured the wine. The apartment was dim except for the flickering candlelight reflecting off the glass walls. The city lights outside danced across his face. "To Madeline Hart," he said, raising his glass, "the woman who did what everyone said she couldn't." I clinked mine against his. "To survival disguised as ambition." He smiled. "You always make victory sound tragic." "Maybe because it used to be," I said, sipping slowly. "When I started this, I thought if I worked hard enough, my parents would notice, that I could earn my way into being loved. And now I looked out the window. Now I know better. Love shouldn't have to be earned." He reached across the table, covering my hand with his. "You don't have to prove anything anymore." "I know," I whispered. But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it. Later that night, while Evan cleaned up, I wandered into the living room. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. A notification from Instagram. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Logan Hart had posted again, my brother, my parents' pride. The photo showed them smiling in front of a vacation home in Maui. The caption read, "Family tradition continues." My father stood in the center, arm draped around Logan's shoulder. Mom glowing beside him. The ache hit like muscle memory. Same posturing, same words, same absence of me. Evan appeared behind me, drying his hands. "Still torturing yourself with them, I just wanted to see," I said. He took the phone, set it down gently. "You're not missing anything. You never were. I wanted to believe that." The next morning, my phone rang while I was reviewing contracts. The number was unfamiliar but local. I hesitated, then answered. "This is Madeline." Silence, then a voice I hadn't heard in 5 years. "Maddie." My hand froze on the desk. "Mom." She exhaled, the sound brittle, rehearsed. "We need to talk. Family meeting tomorrow." The words hung heavy, absurd in their suddenness. "Family meeting," I repeated. After 5 years of silence, "This is important," she said quickly. "Your father and I, well, there are things we should discuss in person." I could hear him in the background, the familiar impatience in his voice. "Tell her to be here." "What things?" I asked. "It's complicated," she said. "Just come home, tomorrow at 2. Before I could answer, she hung up. I stared at the phone, heart hammering. The same number that had ignored birthdays, milestones, holidays, now calling as if nothing had happened. Joanna knocked lightly and stepped inside. "Everything okay?" my mother called, I said. She raised a brow. "After how long?" 5 years. Joanna's face softened. "And they want a family meeting." For what, I laughed under my breath. "That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?" She pulled up a chair. "Maddie, people who vanish for years don't just show up out of guilt. They show up when they need something." I met her gaze. "You think that's what this is? I think you should prepare for it," she said. Emotionally and otherwise. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at my phone. Evan leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. "You're going to go," he said. "I don't know." "You already know," he replied. "You've been waiting for this call your whole life. Not because you owe them anything, but because you need to see who they really are." I nodded slowly. "Then I'll go." The next morning I woke before dawn. The sky was steel gray, rain misting against the windows. I dressed in silence, dark jeans, white blouse, gray coat. Not armor exactly, but close enough. As I walked to my car, the air was cool and heavy, the streets slick with rain. I paused before getting in, watching the droplets collect on the hood. Somewhere between anxiety and resolve, I whispered to myself, "This time I walk in on my own terms." The drive to Bellevue felt endless. Familiar streets blurred past the park where Logan had won his first soccer trophy, the old diner where Mom and I used to sit after school before she started canceling on me. Every memory was a ghost riding shotgun. By the time I pulled into the circular driveway, my heart was steady again. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the shutters dull, the roses out of bloom. But the perfection still lingered, polished, practiced, performative. I sat for a moment, engine running, watching my reflection in the rearview mirror. I didn't see the neglected daughter anymore. I saw a woman who had built her own world. When I finally stepped out, the cold bit through my coat. Before I could knock, the door opened. My father stood there, gaze assessing. "You've done well for yourself," he said. Not a greeting, a judgment. "Yes," I said evenly. My mother appeared behind him, pearls, perfectly aligned, voice trembling with rehearsed warmth. "Madeline, you look successful." "Thank you," I said. "Why am I here?" She blinked, thrown off by my bluntness. "We'll explain tomorrow. The whole family will be here." "Of course," I murmured. As I turned to leave, my father's voice stopped me. "You should wear something professional tomorrow. Appearances matter." I smiled, the kind of smile that cut more than it comforted. "Don't worry, Dad. I've learned that lesson from the best." Back in the car, rain tapped lightly against the windshield. I sat there for a long time, engine idling, watching the house fade behind a veil of drizzle. They'd finally called, and tomorrow they'd learn the cost of ignoring me for half a lifetime. I put the car in gear, the tires hissing softly on wet pavement. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one waiting for their approval. This time, they were waiting for mine. The hum of conversation in the Lumosync office had never felt so alive. The day after our contract announcement, the team buzzed around like electricity. Someone had brought cupcakes, another had streamed the news clip on the big screen. Lumosync, a fast-rising Seattle tech firm led by CEO Madeline Hart, the anchor announced. I watched my own face appear on national television, smiling in a blue blazer, shaking hands with city officials. The applause from my team filled the space warm and genuine. For the first time, I allowed myself to breathe it in validation not from them but from myself. Evan appeared behind me, resting his chin on my shoulder. "You're officially famous," he teased, but there was pride in his voice. I laughed softly. Just another Tuesday. Still, as I turned to the monitor one last time, I felt something strange. A whisper of nerves, as if the past might somehow notice the present. I brushed it away. Success was loud enough to drown ghosts. By afternoon, my phone buzzed across my desk. Unknown number. I ignored it. It buzzed again. Then again. Finally, I picked up, expecting a journalist or sponsor. "Hello," I said. "Maddie." My mother's voice. The air in my lungs froze. It had been 5 years since I'd last heard it. Her tone was composed, almost rehearsed. "We need to talk. Family meeting tomorrow." "Family meeting," I repeated, the disbelief audible. After 5 years of silence, "This is important," she insisted. I heard a faint rustle, and then my father's voice in the background, the same impatient tone I remembered too well. "Tell her, it's important." I felt my throat tighten. Important like my wedding or my graduation or the 5 years you didn't call silence. Then her voice again, clipped and uneasy. "It's complicated. Your brother's involved. It's about the family." I almost laughed, a hollow sound. Now I'm family again. "This isn't the time to be difficult, Madeline," she said, the old authority creeping back. "Tomorrow at 2. Before I could answer, the line went dead. I sat motionless, phone still against my ear, pulse hammering in my chest. My reflection in the glass window stared back at me, the CEO everyone admired, still caught off guard by the same voice that once dictated her worth. Evan found me minutes later. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said gently, handing me coffee. "My mother called," I whispered. He blinked, setting the mug down. "After all this time, apparently there's a family meeting," I said, almost mockingly. He sighed, sitting on the edge of my desk. "Let me guess. They saw the broadcast." I met his eyes. 5 years of nothing, and suddenly they need to talk. "You think that's coincidence?" Evan shook his head slowly. "Maybe they saw your success and realized what they lost." I gave a short, bitter laugh. "No, they realized what they need." He reached for my hand. "Then go. Hear them out, not for them, but for you. This time you're the one holding the power." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window of our apartment, city lights flickering like restless thoughts. Part of me wanted to delete her number, pretend the call never happened. Another part, the child still craving recognition, wanted to hope it meant something real. But logic spoke louder. People like my parents didn't apologize. They recalculated. The next morning I walked into Joanna's office. She was reviewing investment proposals, calm as always. "They called," I said simply. She didn't ask who. She already knew. "And you," I said. "I'd go." Joanna closed her folder, studying me with steady eyes. "Remember this, Maddie. When people who hurt you come back, it's rarely because they've changed. It's because your silence stopped serving them." I nodded. "I'm not walking in as their daughter anymore." "No," she said softly. "You're walking in as the woman they failed to raise." Her words followed me all day. By noon I was in my car, parked outside the Lumosync headquarters. The sky was overcast, Seattle gray, a kind of weather that always made me reflective. Evan texted, "Remember who you are. Call me if you need extraction." I smiled at the message. He always knew when to lighten the weight in my chest. The drive to Bellevue took 40 minutes. The closer I got, the tighter my hands gripped the wheel. Suburban streets I hadn't driven in years rolled past the coffee shop where I used to study, the park bench where I'd once waited for a ride that never came. Every corner whispered memories I no longer wanted. Halfway there, another message popped up from Joanna. "Boundaries aren't punishments, they're protection." I repeated it out loud like a mantra. When I finally turned into the old neighborhood, the sight of the Hart House hit me like a photograph from another lifetime. The same white columns, the same immaculately trimmed hedges, the same illusion of perfection. But the energy was different now. I wasn't arriving as the forgotten daughter desperate to please. I was the woman they'd underestimated, the one they'd have to face on equal ground. I parked in the circular driveway next to the aging Lexus that had replaced my father's old BMW. My Porsche gleamed beside it, a silent symbol of everything they didn't give me. For a moment I sat still, breathing. My heart didn't race. It pulsed slow and steady. Through the window I saw movement, my mother adjusting her pearls, my father standing stiffly by the doorway. They looked smaller than I remembered, their confidence dulled by time and consequence. Before stepping out, I opened my phone and started the voice recorder. Habit, not paranoia. Evidence, not emotion. The gravel crunched beneath my heels as I approached the house. When the door swung open, my father's face flickered between pride and apprehension. "You've done well for yourself," he said. Not hello. Not I've missed you? Yes, I replied evenly. My mother forced a smile, her gaze darting to the Porsche behind me. Beautiful car. I met her eyes. Is that why you called? A faint flush crept up her neck. Let's not start like this, dear. We have a lot to discuss. Inside, everything smelled the same lemon polish and faint cologne. The family portraits lined the hallway, Daniel's wedding photo. Daniel's law firm award, Daniel's twins in matching outfits. My absence hung between frames like an invisible ghost. As they led me to the dining room, I noticed the table set with coffee cups and documents, not lunch, not hospitality. Negotiation. The very air buzzed with unspoken tension like a courtroom about to start proceedings. For a fleeting second, I remembered standing in that same room at 16 begging them to come to my state science fair. My mother had said, "We can't be everywhere, Maddie." My father had added, "Your brother needs us more." Now here they were needing me. I sat down at the far end of the table, folding my hands. So I said quietly, "What's this about?" They exchanged glances. My father cleared his throat. "We'll explain tomorrow in detail. For now, we just wanted to make sure you'll come." I leaned back, eyes steady. "I'll come," I said. "But don't expect the same girl who left this house." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed my mother's perfectly composed face. When I stepped back outside, the air felt colder. I stood for a moment on the porch, letting the silence stretch. Behind me, through the glass door, I could see their figures, two people who once dictated my every decision, now reduced to waiting on mine. I walked down the steps slowly, heels tapping against the stone. Rain began to fall, soft but steady. As I reached my car, I whispered to myself, "Tomorrow they'll learn that the invisible daughter doesn't beg anymore." I started the engine. The Porsche purred to life, smooth and confident, mirroring the steadiness in my chest. The road ahead shimmered under the drizzle, the same road that once led me away in pain now carried me back with power. This time, I wasn't coming home. I was coming to finish the story. The rain had stopped by the time I pulled into my parents' driveway the next afternoon. The clouds hung low, pale and heavy, as if even the sky was holding its breath. The house looked the same as it had for most of my life, immaculate, expensive, soulless. The kind of perfection that could make you feel small just for existing. I turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal. I'd come here hundreds of times before, but never like this. When I finally stepped out, the air smelled faintly of wet cedar and old roses. My heels clicked against the stone path as I approached the front door. Before I could knock, it swung open. My father stood there, posture rigid, wearing that same neutral expression he used in every family photograph. "You've done well for yourself," he said, eyes flicking to the Porsche behind me. Not a greeting, not warmth, just assessment. "Yes," I replied evenly. His gaze faltered for a second. Then he stepped aside. My mother appeared from the hallway, her pearl earrings perfectly in place, her smile too careful. "Maddie, dear, you look successful." "Thank you," I said, brushing past her perfume cloud and walking inside. The house smelled exactly the same, lemon polish, faint lavender, and something sterile beneath it all. Along the walls, framed photographs of Daniel dominated every inch. Law school graduation, firm, gala, family, Christmas. Not a single trace of me. In the dining room, 3 mugs of coffee sat on the table beside a neat stack of manila folders. The good china, I noticed, was nowhere to be seen. This wasn't a reunion. It was business. My brother Daniel entered a moment later, shoulders squared, under a designer jacket that didn't quite fit the way it used to. He smiled, the same rehearsed grin that had charmed teachers and relatives our whole lives. "Hey sis, long time." I returned the smile without meaning it. 5 years, give or take. "Feels like yesterday," he said already, pulling out a chair at the table. For a moment, silence hovered between us, thick as dust. I stood clutching my purse, unwilling to sit first. So I said finally, "Why am I here?" My father folded his hands in front of him like a judge about to deliver a ruling. "Your brother is facing some temporary financial challenges. The market has been unpredictable, and the firm's partnership restructuring has left him well overextended." Daniel shifted in his seat, pretending embarrassment. "It's not as bad as it sounds," he said quickly. My mother sighed dramatically. "The twins' tuition is overdue, the mortgage is behind, and the firm has been slow paying bonuses. It's a rough season, that's all. We thought as a family we could help each other through it." I let their words hang in the air, deliberate, watching them twist under my silence. My father leaned forward. "You've been very fortunate, Madeline. We're proud of what you've achieved." "Are you?" I asked quietly. "Because the last time I checked, you couldn't even be bothered to show up for my wedding." My mother's smile froze. "That's not fair." "No," I interrupted, my tone calm but cold. "Fair would have been showing up. Fair would have been returning my calls. Fair would have been treating me like a daughter, not a placeholder for your disappointments." Daniel rolled his eyes. "Come on, Maddie. You're still holding grudges. Families fight, it happens." "Families fight," I said, "and then they make it right. You all just pretended I didn't exist." My father straightened, irritation cracking through his composure. "You're overreacting. We supported you in our own way. By ignoring me, by giving you independence," he shot back. I almost laughed. "No, Dad. You gave me abandonment and called it independence." A sharp silence fell. My mother's eyes glistened, but not with remorse, only frustration at losing control. "We're not here to argue," she said. "We just need your help. Think about the children, Maddie. They shouldn't have to suffer for financial issues." "And what exactly are you asking for?" I asked. My father slid one of the folders across the polished oak table. "A short-term loan. We've already filled out the paperwork. You can transfer the funds through your company's trust account. It's all straightforward." I stared at the folder without touching it. The confidence in his voice, the assumption it was all too familiar. I looked up slowly. "So this isn't about forgiveness. It's about a transaction." Daniel frowned. "Don't make it sound ugly. Your family. We help each other." I tilted my head. "Funny that only seems to apply when I have something you need." My mother's voice trembled just enough to sound sincere. "Sweetheart, we just want to rebuild. Maybe this could be a fresh start." I met her gaze. "A fresh start requires accountability. Do you even know how many milestones you missed? How many times I wondered what was wrong with me, that you couldn't love me the way you loved him?" Daniel pushed back his chair, his patience gone. "You always do this, turn everything into some sob story about how hard your life was. Newsflash, Maddie, some of us were busy doing real things." "Real things," I said softly. "You mean being handed everything while I earned mine." He slammed his palm on the table. "You always had to prove something, didn't you? Always showing off like success means you're better than us." I stood, my voice calm, steady. "No, Daniel. It means I stopped waiting for you to see me." My father's tone sharpened. "We're still your parents, Madeline. You owe us some respect." I looked him dead in the eye. "Respect is earned, not inherited." The air thickened, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one shrinking under its weight. I reached for my purse and unlatched it, the metallic click echoing like a punctuation mark. Their eyes followed my hands, expectant, greedy. But instead of a checkbook, I placed a single document on the table, a printed press release. My mother frowned. "What's that?" "The Lumosync Foundation," I said. $16 million dedicated to scholarships for young women in technology. "The press announcement goes out tomorrow," Daniel blinked. $16 million, you're donating it to girls like me, I said simply. The ones no one showed up for. My father's face darkened. "You're wasting your money on strangers while your own family struggles," I smiled faintly. Maybe I'm just redefining what family means. For a long moment no one spoke. Then my mother whispered, "You've changed." "Finally," I said. I picked up my phone and turned it toward them. The recording app glowed red. "Just for transparency," I said. "In case there's any confusion about what was said today." My father stiffened. Daniel looked furious. "You think you're so clever," he spat. "No," I said softly. "Just done being controlled." I slipped my phone into my bag and stepped away from the table. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor, each sound a small declaration of freedom. "You can't just leave," my mother cried. "We're your family." I turned back my hand on the doorknob. "You had the chance to be my family," I said. "You chose convenience instead. Now I'm choosing peace." I walked out the door, closing behind me, with a soft click that sounded more like closure than goodbye. Outside, the sky had cleared. The driveway glistened with leftover rain, each droplet catching the faint light like tiny mirrors. As I slid into the driver's seat, I caught my reflection in the window, not the desperate daughter anymore, but a woman in full control. The Porsche hummed beneath me, smooth and powerful. I exhaled long and slow, letting years of tension drain away. When I turned onto the main road, my phone buzzed with a message from Evan. "You okay?" I typed back. "Better than okay?" For the first time in my life, the road home didn't feel like escape. It felt like victory. That night, Seattle glowed like a constellation outside my window. I sat on the couch, still wearing the navy suit from earlier, fingers tracing the rim of my wine glass as the city's hum filled the silence. Evan sat beside me, his voice low. "How bad was it?" "Exactly what we expected," I said. Dad tried to act like it was a board meeting. Mom went for guilt, and Daniel threw a tantrum when I said no. Evan's jaw tightened, but he didn't say "I told you so." He just reached over and brushed my hand. "You did what you had to do." "I didn't yell," I said quietly. "I didn't even cry. I just walked out." "That's called growth," he said with a half smile. When he finally went to bed, I stayed by the window. The reflection in the glass looked nothing like the girl who used to beg for attention. But my chest still ached with the familiar weight, not regret, but grief for what never was. My phone lit up on the table. I ignored it, then watched as another message came through. Then another. By the fifth notification, curiosity won. "Mom, Madeline, please call me back." "Mom, we didn't mean for things to go like that." Then the tone shifted. "Mom, people will think terrible things if you abandon your family." "Mom, how could you humiliate us like this?" I turned the phone face down and whispered into the quiet. "Let them think whatever they want." By morning, my inbox was a battlefield. Friends from high school, distant cousins, even old coworkers had forwarded screenshots of Facebook posts. My mother had written, "Some people forget where they came from. Family means nothing when money blinds the heart." My brother had shared it with the caption, "Success changes people." Dozens of comments flooded beneath sympathy for them, accusations toward me. Ungrateful daughter. Selfish. Cold-hearted. At first it hurt. Then it made me laugh. Of course. This was the only language they knew, manipulation dressed up as morality. By noon, Joanna called. "You've seen the posts?" "Yes," I said. "Do not respond," she instructed. "Not a word. The best thing you can do is stay quiet and keep doing the work." "I wasn't planning to fight with Facebook," I said dryly. "Good," Joanna replied. "Because you don't fight mud with mud, Maddie. You rise above it." I ended the call feeling lighter, though part of me still wanted to scream. The comments stung not because they were true, but because they were so familiar. The narrative was always the same, their pain first, my silence painted as cruelty. That afternoon, two of my staff members, Janine and Carlos, stood awkwardly by my office door. "Hey, Maddie," Janine said, "there's some talk online. Do you want us to take down comments on the Lumosync page?" "No," I said, standing. "Leave them. People can say what they want. We'll drown it out with progress." Carlos hesitated. "There's a rumor going around that your family's filing something against the foundation." I smiled thinly. "Then they're going to meet my lawyer before they meet God." Their laughter was cautious, but it broke the tension. I watched them go and exhaled. Beneath the calm, exhaustion pulsed. That evening I went to therapy for the first time in months. Patricia, my therapist, poured chamomile tea and waited for me to speak. "They're doing what they always do," I said, "playing the victims." "And how does that make you feel?" she asked. I let out a shaky laugh. "Honestly, free. They've said the worst things they could say, and I'm still here, still standing." Patricia smiled gently. "You've spent most of your life protecting their feelings. It's okay to protect your own now. It doesn't feel cruel." "No," she said. "It feels like healing." That word lingered long after I left her office. The next day, Evan surprised me with dinner at home, takeout sushi, and candles, the kind of quiet comfort that didn't need grand gestures. "You've had the longest week," he said, pouring me wine. "Longest 5 years," I corrected. He grinned. "True. But you're still here, and you're winning." After dinner, I scrolled through my emails. Most were congratulatory business partners, journalists, women, thanking me for what the foundation was doing. But one stood out, a message from Delia Warren, the journalist from the Portland Business Journal. "Hi, Madeline," it read. "We're preparing a feature on self-made women in tech who've used their success for social impact. I'd love to include your story. Let me know if you're open to a short interview." I stared at the message for a long time. I could practically hear Joanna's voice. "You can't control what people say, only what story you tell." I typed back, "Yes. But we focus on purpose, not drama." 3 days later, the article went live. The headline read, "From Invisible Daughter to CEO Madeline Hart on Turning Pain into Power." The piece was factual, respectful, and powerful. It mentioned the foundation, my mission, and my philosophy on resilience, nothing about my family's slander. Within hours, the post was trending. Comments poured in, not attacks, but empathy. Women wrote paragraphs about their own experiences with toxic parents' favoritism, neglect. Some even said my story gave them courage to set boundaries. Reading those words, something shifted inside me. For years, I'd been chasing my family's approval. Now strangers, thousands of them, were saying, "We see you." It was strange how validation from people I'd never met could feel more genuine than any love I'd known. That night, Evan scrolled through social media beside me. "You're officially viral," he said. In a good way this time. I smiled. I'd rather be known for what I built than what I broke. The calm didn't last long. 2 days later, an email from a law firm popped into my inbox. Notice of intent to mediate. Hart family versus Madeline Hart. My stomach clenched as I read the words. Allegations of defamation, emotional distress, and damage to family reputation. I laughed out loud. The irony was too much. Evan looked up from his laptop. "What is it? They're suing me," I said, sliding my phone across the table. He raised an eyebrow. "For telling the truth. Apparently that's illegal now." He reached for my hand. "Joanna will handle it." "She will," I said. "But it's time they realized I don't scare easily." The next morning, Joanna's office was all efficiency and controlled fury. "We'll respond formally," she said, flipping through the notice. "You have every document, every recording. They're bluffing." "Let them," I said. "I'm done playing defense." That night I sat on the balcony, the city lights stretching below like veins of gold. The air was cool, crisp, alive. My phone buzzed again, another text from Mom. "You've gone too far this time. We're your family, Maddie. Blood matters." I typed back, then deleted, then typed again. Finally, I sent 3 words. "So does peace." I locked the phone and set it aside. The rain had started again, gentle, cleansing. I watched the droplets race down the glass, each one catching light before disappearing. When Evan joined me, he handed me a mug of tea. "They're not done yet, are they?" "No," I said. "But neither am I." He smiled, resting a hand on my shoulder. "Good. Because the world's starting to see who you really are." I looked out at the skyline. The tower lights the reflection of my own silhouette in the glass. For the first time in years, the reflection didn't look lonely. It looked strong. The next morning brought another email, this time from Delia. "Your article is inspiring women nationwide. Would you consider a follow-up interview?" I smiled and replied, "Let's talk about legacy." My family could keep their lies. The truth had found its audience. And I finally had my freedom, not from them but from the need to be understood by them. When I turned off the lights that night, I whispered to myself, "You did it. You walked away and you didn't look back." And in the quiet hum of the city I knew, that was the real victory. By Monday morning, the buzz around Lumosync had shifted from celebration to tension. Janine knocked on my office door, her expression uneasy. "You might want to see this," she said, handing me her phone. The headline read, "CEO abandons elderly parents after striking it rich." My stomach didn't drop this time, it just hardened. The article was poorly written, full of speculation and half-truths, quoting an unnamed family source. But the pictures were real photos of my parents outside their house, looking frail and sorrowful. Evan appeared in the doorway behind her. "You're trending," he said, his tone grim, "for all the wrong reasons." I scrolled through the comments. Ungrateful, heartless, typical modern daughter. A few defended me, but most were content to vilify a woman they'd never met. I handed Janine back her phone. "Let it burn itself out," I said calmly. "Should we release a statement?" she asked. "No, we don't respond to gossip." When she left, Evan closed the door and leaned against it. Okay, I knew they'd do this," I said, staring out the window. "They can't stand losing control, so they weaponize pity. It's their favorite trick." He came closer. "You don't have to prove anything, Maddie." "I know," I said softly, though a small part of me still wanted to. Years of silence had trained me to crave defense. But not today. That afternoon, Joanna walked into my office without knocking. "I assume you've seen the circus," she said, tossing a folded newspaper onto my desk. "Yes." She studied me for a moment, her sharp eyes searching. "You're calm. Good. That means we can use this." I frowned. "Use it. You can't silence lies, but you can drown them out with truth," she said. "We'll tell your story, but on your terms." I hesitated. "That sounds dangerously close to playing their game." Joanna smiled. "No, dear. It's changing the rules." By the next morning, she had arranged an exclusive interview with Portland Business Journal, the same reporter who had written the last feature, Delia Warren. When I walked into the studio, the camera lights were already warming the room, soft and bright, like sunrise. Delia greeted me with a kind smile. "I appreciate you trusting me with this," she said. "I'm not here to attack anyone," I told her. "I just want people to understand why I built what I built." "Then let's start there," she said, signaling to her crew. When the red light blinked on, Delia's tone shifted from friendly to professional. "Madeline Hart, founder of Lumosync and the Women in Tech Foundation, you've become a symbol of empowerment and independence. But recent reports paint a different picture. How do you respond to those who say you turned your back on your family?" I took a slow breath. Cameras had never made me nervous, but this question hit close. "They turned away long before I did," I said finally. "I just stopped chasing closed doors." Silence. Then Delia nodded and her voice softened. "That's powerful." We spoke for nearly an hour about the foundation, about how pain can become purpose. I told her about the young women we were funding, how many had faced obstacles not unlike mine. "They're brilliant," I said. "They just need someone to believe in them before the world does." Delia smiled. "And what do you hope people take from your story?" "That family isn't about who shares your blood," I answered. "It's about who shows up and keeps showing up." When the interview ended, she reached out and squeezed my hand. "You have no idea how many women need to hear that," she said. 2 days later, the article went live. The title read, "Self-Made CEO Builds a Legacy Beyond Blood." Within hours, it exploded across social media. Women shared it with captions like "I needed this today," and finally someone said it. The comments were filled with stories, daughters of narcissistic parents, women who'd spent decades apologizing for existing single mothers, building new homes after being cast out. Build your own family trended by evening. My inbox flooded with messages of support. Thank you for saying what so many of us feel but can't voice. For the first time, the noise wasn't about shame, it was about solidarity. Joanna called that night. "You won," she said simply. I laughed softly. "It doesn't feel like winning. It feels quiet." "Quiet," she replied, "is what victory sounds like to people who've survived chaos." But peace never lasts long with my family. The following morning, an email arrived from a law firm representing my parents. Formal demand for public apology and retraction. They claimed emotional distress, damage to reputation, and irreparable familial harm. I forwarded it to Joanna without comment. 10 minutes later, she called, her voice almost amused. "They really don't learn, do they? They've mistaken my silence for weakness their whole lives," I said. "Let's remind them it's strategy." Her legal team drafted a single-page response. "Any further defamatory statements will result in immediate litigation." That afternoon, my mother attempted another Facebook post accusing me of using trauma for publicity. Within minutes, hundreds of strangers flooded her comments, quoting, "My interview family is who shows up." She deleted the post by evening. When the dust settled, I sat alone in my office, scrolling through the article one more time. My photo filled the page, not smiling, not posed, just me. I thought about all the years I'd been invisible in this same city, the nights I'd cried over their approval. And now people saw me not as their daughter but as myself. Evan found me there, still staring at the screen. "You look like someone who just won a war," he said. "Maybe I did," I replied quietly. He came closer, resting a hand on my shoulder. "You thought revenge would feel loud, didn't you?" I smiled. Turns out, real revenge is peace. Later that week, we held our quarterly meeting for the foundation. The office was brighter than usual, laughter echoing through the halls, the air charged with new purpose. Applications for the next round of scholarships had tripled since the article. When I entered the boardroom, Joanna stood at the head of the table. "Ladies," she announced, "we've officially gone national. Sponsors from Chicago and New York are reaching out." The room erupted in applause. Maddie from 5 years ago would have doubted she belonged in that space. The woman I was now knew she'd earned it. After the meeting, Joanna lingered. "You've changed the conversation," she said. "Not just for yourself, but for every woman who's ever been told to stay quiet." I looked out the window at the city below. "They taught me silence," I said. "You taught me what to do with it." That evening, I went home to find a small envelope propped against my front door. My name written in my mother's careful handwriting. Inside was a single line on stationery. "We'd like to talk. No lawyers." Evan watched me read it. "What are you going to do?" I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. "Nothing tonight," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "You're not even curious." I am, I admitted. "But this time they'll wait for me." Outside, the streetlights flickered on, bathing the world in gold. I felt no fear, no bitterness, only a quiet certainty. The tide had turned, not because I fought harder, but because I finally stopped swimming toward people who wanted me to drown. "They finally want peace," I said softly, almost to myself. "But this time it'll be on my terms." Evan reached for my hand. "That's how real closure happens." I smiled and looked out into the night. The wind shifted, cool and gentle, carrying the faint scent of rain. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a storm was coming. It felt like the world had exhaled with me. The morning rain in Seattle drummed softly against my office window, steady and rhythmic like a quiet warning. On my desk sat the cream-colored envelope that had been slipped under my door the night before. My mother's handwriting curled across the surface in blue ink. "We'd like to talk. No lawyers." The words were neat, deliberate, almost rehearsed like everything she did. I traced the letters with my fingertip for a long moment before setting it down. Joanna entered without knocking, carrying 2 coffees. She placed one in front of me, glanced at the envelope, and said, "So they've changed tactics." "They always do," I replied. "Guilt stopped working, so now it's nostalgia." "Are you going to meet them?" "I haven't decided." Joanna studied me carefully. "If you do, go as who you are now, not as the little girl who still hopes they'll love her differently." "I think that girl died the day I walked out of that house," I said quietly. "Good," Joanna said, taking a sip of her coffee. "Then bury her properly." The words lingered long after she left. That night I sat with Evan in our living room, the city lights flickering beyond the glass wall. He was flipping through a script on his laptop when he looked up. "You've been staring at that letter for an hour," he said. I smiled faintly. "You timed me 38 minutes technically." He set the laptop aside. "You're thinking about going." "I am." He leaned forward. "Why?" "Because if I don't, they'll just keep finding ways to invade my peace. Maybe it's better to end it properly face to face." He nodded slowly. "And if they haven't changed, then I'll walk away again," I said, meeting his gaze. This time without guilt. The next afternoon I chose a gray wool coat and tied my hair back. No makeup beyond a touch of mascara. Power didn't need decoration. The letter had suggested Green Lake Cafe, the same place we used to go when I was a kid, back when family still meant Sunday breakfasts and shared pancakes. It was an intentional choice. My mother never left symbolism to chance. The cafe smelled like roasted coffee and rain-soaked wood. I arrived 10 minutes early, ordered a latte, and took a seat by the window. I didn't check my phone. I didn't fidget. I just watched the raindrops slide down the glass, merging into small rivers that disappeared into the gray world outside. They arrived exactly on time. My father first wearing a beige trench coat and the same stiffness he'd worn my whole life. My mother followed, clutching her purse like it held something fragile. They hesitated at the door before spotting me. My mother smiled hesitantly. "Madeline." "Mom, Dad." My voice was steady, polite. They sat across from me, both looking smaller than I remembered. Time had softened their edges, but not their control. My mother folded her hands on the table. "You look well," she said. "So do you," I lied. A waitress appeared to take their order. They both asked for coffee black, no sugar, no cream. The silence that followed was unbearable in its familiarity. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "We should have been there," he said. "At my wedding," I asked. "At everything," he said, glancing at my mother. "We made mistakes." My mother's voice wavered. "We didn't realize how much it hurt you." I stared at her. "You realized. You just didn't care enough to stop." Her eyes filled with tears. "Can't we put that behind us? Family should stick together." There it was, the phrase that had always ended every argument when I was a child. I used to think it was a command for unity. Now I recognized it for what it was, an excuse. My father leaned forward. "We're not perfect, Maddie, but we're still your parents." I set my cup down. Being a parent is a role, not a title. "And you both stopped playing it a long time ago." The air tightened between us. My mother reached for her coffee, her fingers trembling slightly. "People think we're terrible parents. Do you have any idea how that feels?" I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "You mean the way it felt when you made me invisible in my own life?" She flinched, her tears falling freely. "Now you've changed," she whispered. "Yes," I said. I finally stopped apologizing for existing. My father's jaw clenched. "We gave you life, Madeline." "And I gave it meaning," I replied. "That's not the same thing." He looked away, his shoulders sagging. My mother's hand crept across the table as if to reach for mine, but I didn't move. I couldn't. The distance between us wasn't just emotional, it was structural, built from years of silence and neglect. "I don't hate you," I said after a long pause. I just don't trust you with access to my peace. We just want a chance to start over, my mother pleaded. Starting over requires accountability, I said, and so far all I hear are excuses. My father bristled. You think we owe you an apology for not attending your every event? We had lives responsibilities, and I was your responsibility, I said sharply. But you were too busy polishing Daniel's trophies to notice. His mouth opened, then closed. My mother wiped at her cheeks, whispering, You'll regret this distance someday. I took a slow sip of my coffee. Maybe. But at least the distance is honest. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The rain outside softened to a drizzle, tapping lightly against the window like a metronome for the silence. I reached into my bag, pulled out a small card, and placed it on the table. My assistant's contact information, I said. If you ever decide to apologize for the right reasons, not for money, not for image, you can reach me through her. Otherwise, let's consider this goodbye. My mother's lip trembled. Madeline, please. I stood, slipping my bag over my shoulder. Mom, I said gently, forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it's just letting go of the hope that things could have been different. Her tears spilled again. My father sat stone, still staring at the untouched coffee between his hands. As I walked toward the door, I heard my mother's voice crack behind me. You really don't need us anymore, do you? I turned slightly, meeting her gaze one last time. I needed you when you didn't show up. That's the difference. Outside, the air was sharp with the scent of rain and pine. I pulled my coat tighter around me and breathed in deeply. The lake shimmered through the mist, quiet and silver. For the first time, I didn't feel like the little girl waiting for someone to come get her. Back in the car, I sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. My reflection in the mirror looked calm, almost peaceful. I whispered to it, I didn't get the apology I wanted. But I got the freedom I needed. By the time I returned to the office, the clouds had lifted. Evan was waiting in the lobby, leaning against the reception desk with that familiar look of concern. How did it go? He asked. Exactly as it was supposed to, I said, slipping my coat off. He followed me into the elevator. You sure you're okay? I am, I said, smiling faintly. I think I finally closed the book, instead of just reading the same chapter again. In my office, a new file sat on the desk, the expansion proposal Joanna had been preparing for the Foundation's national rollout. I ran my fingers over the title page. Lumosync Foundation, Empowering Women Nationwide. Evan placed a hand on my shoulder. What are you thinking? That maybe closure isn't an ending, I said softly. It's space for something new. I signed the approval papers and set them aside. Through the window, the late afternoon sun finally broke through the clouds, spilling golden light across the skyline. It was fragile, fleeting, but beautiful. They finally want peace, I murmured, watching the light shift. But this time it's mine to keep. Evan smiled. Then let's make sure you never have to fight for it again. As the sun dipped lower, I turned from the window and whispered to myself, letting go is its own kind of justice. And for the first time I believed it. A year later, I woke up to sunlight, spilling across the hardwood floor of my office. The city below glowed with morning clarity, the kind of rare Seattle day that made the water look like glass. My name gleamed on the plaque by the door, Madeline Hart, founder, Lumosync Women in Tech Foundation. Every time I saw it, I felt the same quiet disbelief. Not pride exactly, something deeper. Peace. Outside my window, the hum of the foundation buzzed softly. Laughter in the break room, keyboards clicking, coffee brewing. The air felt alive with possibility. 12 women now worked here full-time, all brilliant in their own ways. I'd stopped calling them my staff months ago. They were family, the kind that showed up every morning and gave everything they had. In the conference room, a new banner hung, 1 year of empowering futures. Joanna stood at the head of the table, her usual poise mixed with pride. We've just been listed among the top 10 nonprofits supporting women in STEM, she announced. Congratulations, everyone. The room erupted in applause. I smiled, clapping along. Joanna looked at me. You did this, Maddie. No, I said. We did. After the meeting, I walked through the office, stopping at the wall where we kept framed photos of scholarship recipients. Each smiling face represented a life altered by something we built from pain. Beneath one of the frames was a note written in neat cursive. Because of you, I didn't give up. My throat tightened. I traced the edge of the glass with my fingertips, whispering, "That's why we're here." A knock sounded behind me. It was Maya Chen, 17 now, our first scholarship recipient. She'd grown taller, more confident, her long black hair tied in a loose braid. "Miss Hart," she said, smiling, "they told me I could find you here." "Maya," I said warmly, opening my arms. She hugged me quickly, then stepped back, her eyes shining. "I just wanted to say thank you. I got into the University of Washington's engineering program. Full ride. That's incredible. I couldn't have done it without you," she said. "When I applied for the scholarship, my parents told me technology was a boys' field. They said I was wasting time, but you proved them wrong." I felt my chest swell with emotion. "You proved them wrong, Maya. I just opened the door." She grinned. "Then I'm going to build new ones." When she left, I stood for a long time watching her go. The reflection of her energy filled the room. She reminded me of myself, the younger version who once built dreams in silence, hoping someone would notice. But now the story was different. Later that afternoon, Joanna entered my office holding a newspaper folded under her arm. "You might want to see this," she said. The headline was small, tucked in the corner of the business section, "Hart & Associates Law Firm Declares Bankruptcy." I stared at it then, at the grainy photo of my father, shaking hands with someone in front of a for sale sign. Joanna watched my face carefully. "You don't have to read it," she said softly. "I already did," I murmured. "What do you feel?" I set the paper down and leaned back in my chair. "Nothing. Maybe relief." She nodded. "That's what closure feels like." I looked out the window at the skyline, exhaling slowly. I hope they find peace too. Truly. That night, the foundation held its first annual gala. The event hall shimmered with golden light chandeliers reflecting across glass tables lined with candles. The air buzzed with excitement. Evan, dapper in a black tux, stood at the podium testing the mic. "Can we get sound check?" he called to the technician. I stepped onto the stage, smoothing my dress. Evan turned to me, smiling. "Ready as I'll ever be." He took my hand and squeezed it. "You look beautiful. Stop distracting me," I teased. When guests began arriving, investors, local leaders, scholarship donors, the energy in the room swelled. The young women from our programs mingled with them, laughing, networking, shining. It felt like watching seeds blossom. When Evan took the stage to introduce me, his voice carried the warmth I'd fallen in love with. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate not just success, but purpose. And there's no one who embodies that more than the woman who turned her pain into a pathway for others, Madeline Hart." Applause filled the hall as I stepped up to the microphone. For a second, the brightness of the spotlight made it hard to see. But once my eyes adjusted, I saw faces, hundreds of them, looking back with admiration, not pity. When I started this journey, I thought success was revenge. I thought if I built something big enough, loud enough, they'd finally see me. But I was wrong. I paused, glancing toward the table where Joanna sat, her chin resting proudly on her hand. "Success," I continued, "isn't about proving anyone wrong. It's about creating something right. It's about using your strength to make sure others never feel as invisible as you once did." The room was silent still. I took a deep breath. "Family," I said, "isn't always the people you're born to. It's the people who show up, who choose to stay, who build with you. That's the legacy we're creating here together." Applause broke out loud and thunderous. I smiled, blinking back tears. Evan mouthed, "You did it." Afterward, as the music swelled and people danced, Joanna approached with a glass of champagne. "You've built something that will outlive all of us," she said. "You gave me the first chance," I replied. She laughed softly. No, I gave you a door. You built the foundation under it. We stood there for a moment watching Maya on the dance floor, spinning under the lights, her laughter echoing through the hall. It was the sound of everything I'd fought for: freedom, joy, belief. Later, when the event wound down, I stepped outside onto the balcony. The night air was cool, filled with the scent of jasmine from the garden below. Evan joined me, wrapping his jacket around my shoulders. "You miss them sometimes, don't you?" he asked gently. I didn't answer right away. The city stretched out before us, glowing softly. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But missing someone isn't the same as needing them." He nodded. "That's a beautiful kind of freedom." I looked at him, smiling. "It is." We stood there in silence for a while, listening to the hum of the city. Somewhere inside, laughter rippled again, Maya's bright and alive. When we went back inside, Maya rushed up, camera in hand. "Can I get a picture of you two?" she asked. "Only if you're in it too," I said. She laughed, pulling us close as the camera clicked. The flash went off, freezing the moment in light. As the guests began to leave, I caught sight of the framed printouts we'd set near the exit: Lumo Sync Foundation, building futures that don't need permission to exist. I stood before it, reading the words slowly. Then I whispered to myself, "We did it." On the drive home, I rolled down the window, letting the cool wind whip through my hair. The night felt endless, infinite. When we reached our apartment, Evan turned off the car and took my hand. "You know," he said, "Maya's going to give your speech one day." "I hope so," I said softly. "I'll be in the front row." Inside, I hung up my coat and stood for a moment, looking around at the quiet, sunlit space that used to feel too big for just two people. Now it felt full of laughter, of hope, of everything I'd fought to build. Before bed, I opened my journal and wrote, "I spent years trying to earn my family's pride. Now I give it freely to others." I closed it and set it on the nightstand. Outside, the moonlight shimmered across the city like a soft blessing. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was healing anymore. I felt whole. The morning after the gala, I woke to my phone vibrating across the nightstand. Joanna's name glowed on the screen. "You're not going to believe this," she said the second I answered. "Morning Light America just called. They want to feature you on their national broadcast next week. A segment on women who rebuilt themselves." I blinked, still half asleep. "National television prime time. It's huge, Maddie. They've seen your speech from last night. It's already circulating online. The world wants your story." I sat up, pushing the sheets away. "The world," I murmured, "or the version of it that loves redemption stories?" Joanna chuckled softly. "Both. And that's fine. You've earned the right to tell yours." After we hung up, I lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. A year ago, I'd been fighting for peace. Now I was being asked to share it. Evan found me an hour later in the kitchen, still in my robe, sipping coffee and staring out the window. "Joanna called?" he asked, reading my expression. "They want me on national TV," I said. "Morning Light America." His eyes widened. "That's incredible. It's surreal," I admitted. "I used to dream of people seeing me. Now I'm not sure I want them to." Evan walked over, took the cup from my hands, and kissed my forehead. "Be yourself. That's all you've ever needed to be." The day of the interview arrived faster than I expected. I flew to New York the night before, staying in a hotel overlooking Central Park. The city hummed with energy lights spilling across the skyline. When I closed my eyes, I could almost hear the old voices of doubt. My mother's, my father's, but they were distant now, like echoes at the bottom of a well. The next morning, the studio was a blur of movement. Assistants, cameras, lights, makeup brushes. The producer, a cheerful woman named Cassie, guided me to a dressing room. "Miss Hart, we're thrilled to have you," she said, straightening the mic on my lapel. "Ava Miller will interview you. She's known for being tough, but she loves stories of strength. You'll be great." I smiled politely, though my pulse quickened. Once she left, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. The lights around it cast a warm glow, but for a moment, I saw my younger self staring back, the girl who'd waited in silence for her parents' approval. I leaned closer, whispering, "You don't need them anymore." When the stage manager called my name, I stepped into the studio. The air was cool and crisp, cameras already in place. The set was beautiful, soft gold and cream tones, sunlight pouring through artificial windows. Ava Miller, elegant and composed, greeted me with a firm handshake. "Madeline Hart," she said. "I've been looking forward to this." "Thank you for having me," I replied, matching her calm tone. We took our seats, the cameras rolled, the red light blinked on. "Good morning, America." Ava began, her voice smooth and confident. "Our next guest is a woman who turned pain into purpose. From tech entrepreneur to philanthropist, she's redefining what it means to build a legacy. Please welcome Madeline Hart." The studio audience applauded. I smiled, keeping my breathing steady. Ava turned to me. "Madeline, your story has resonated with millions. From the launch of LumoSync to your foundation for women in technology, you've inspired a generation of creators. How did you find the strength to keep going after everything you've been through?" I answered easily, my rehearsed calm taking over. "At some point, I realized survival wasn't enough. I wanted meaning. I wanted to turn what broke me into something that could build others." The audience nodded, silent but attentive. Ava smiled. "That's powerful." We spoke for 10 minutes about innovation, empowerment, and legacy. I talked about Maya's scholarship, about the girls who'd written me letters saying our program changed their lives. It felt natural, hopeful, until Ava's tone shifted. "One last question, Madeline," she said gently. "Your story began with loss, being estranged from your family. Many viewers are wondering, have you forgiven them?" The air left my lungs for a beat. The studio fell quiet, cameras fixed on my face. Somewhere in the control booth, I heard a faint rustle, as if even the crew held their breath. For a second, my mind flickered through images: my mother's tearful eyes at the cafe, my father's silence, the empty chairs at my wedding. Then the pictures changed: Joanna's steady hand on my shoulder, Evan's quiet strength, Maya's smile under the gala lights. I looked back at Ava, voice soft but sure. "Forgiveness isn't a door you open for someone else," I said. "It's the one you walk through yourself." Ava blinked, surprised. "So do you think you've forgiven them?" I smiled faintly. "I think I've stopped needing anything from them. That's my version of forgiveness." The silence in the studio deepened, then broke with gentle applause. Ava's expression softened. "That's beautiful, Madeline. Thank you for sharing that." When the cameras turned off, she reached for my hand. "You just said what millions of people need to hear," she whispered. Backstage, Cassie rushed up, beaming. "That was perfect. Honest. You owned the room." Evan met me near the dressing room, his face glowing with pride. "You were incredible." I exhaled, letting the tension slip from my shoulders. "I didn't even plan to say that," I admitted. "That's why it worked," he said. "You didn't perform, you told the truth." By evening, clips of the interview were everywhere. My quote about forgiveness trended on social media within hours. Hashtags flooded the internet: number, family is who shows up; number, walk through your own door. Women from all over the country began sharing their stories. Daughters estranged from parents. Mothers raising children alone. People finally breaking cycles of silence. I sat in my hotel room watching the flood of messages scroll across the screen. One comment stopped me cold. "You helped me forgive myself." Tears stung my eyes. I closed the laptop and pressed my palms together. For so long, I'd chased validation from the wrong people. Now strangers were writing to say they saw themselves in my healing. It felt like everything I'd built had finally found its heartbeat. Later that night, I called Joanna. "You were right," I said. "Truth really does drown out lies." "It always does," she replied. "It just takes time." When I hung up, Evan was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through the reactions online. "You think your parents watched it?" he asked. I hesitated. "Probably." "What do you think they'll do?" "Nothing," I said. "And that's fine. The silence doesn't hurt anymore." He reached for my hand. "Then I think you've truly won." The next morning, my phone buzzed again. Joanna's voice was bright on the line. The Foundation's national expansion has been approved. You're about to change thousands of lives, Maddie. I smiled, gazing out at the sunlight spilling over Central Park. Let's get to work then. As I ended the call, I opened my laptop and drafted a press release. Applications open nationwide, it read. At the bottom I added a single line, family isn't defined by who leaves, it's built by who stays. When I hit send, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. Not triumph, not relief, something quieter, stronger, peace. Outside New York hummed below, alive and endless. I watched the light shift across the skyline and whispered, once I wanted revenge, then I wanted peace. Now I just want to build. And for the first time in my life, I knew I finally was. The morning after the broadcast, I woke to sunlight cutting through the curtains like golden ribbons. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft hum of the city below. Evan was already in the kitchen humming to himself as he brewed coffee. When I walked in, he looked up and smiled. You broke the internet again, he said, sliding a mug toward me. I laughed, still groggy. What did I do this time? He held up his phone. Your interview's at 3 million views. Half the comments are people quoting you about forgiveness. I took a sip of coffee, the warmth grounding me. I didn't think it would matter that much. It mattered, he said softly. People felt seen. We sat together in the kind of silence that only comes after storms, the calm not of emptiness but of arrival. The air smelled like roasted beans and rain, the faint echo of home. By noon, Joanna and Maya arrived at the office with a bouquet of white tulips. Our star, Joanna declared, placing the flowers on my desk. Do you know how many speaking invitations came in overnight, Harvard? Google. Even the United Nations wants you for a Women in Tech panel. I blinked. That's a lot. Maya grinned, her energy bright as always. You're trending everywhere. My classmates were quoting you in the group chat. Someone even made a TikTok remix. I laughed, shaking my head. That's officially how you know you've made it. Joanna leaned against the desk. Enjoy it, Maddie. You've earned it. But as the noise around me grew, congratulations, emails, notifications, I felt something quieter inside. Gratitude, not for the fame, but for the peace that came with knowing I no longer needed to fight to be seen. That afternoon, Joanna gathered us all in the conference room. The walls were covered with framed headlines and photos from the Foundation's events. We have new numbers, she said, clicking her remote. A slide appeared on the screen. The Foundation has expanded to 12 states, over 2,000 applicants this quarter alone. The room erupted in applause. I looked around at their faces, young women full of ambition and fire, and felt a surge of pride so strong it almost hurt. When the meeting ended, Maya lingered. Can I show you something? She asked, pulling out a small tablet. On the screen was her new project, a short film documenting her journey from scholarship recipient to engineer. It's beautiful, I said, watching the clips of her coding late at night, presenting in classrooms, laughing with new friends. There's a scene near the end, she said nervously. It's about you. I frowned slightly. About me, she nodded and pressed play. The final clip showed her speaking directly to the camera. Madeline Hart taught me that family isn't who raises you, it's who believes in you. And because she believed, I learned to believe too. My throat closed. I blinked hard to keep from crying. Maya, I whispered, you're going to change the world. She smiled shyly. I'm just following the path you made. When she left, I sat in the empty conference room for a long time, staring at the faint reflection of myself in the darkened glass. For so many years, I'd chased the wrong kind of love. Now I had it in abundance, not from blood, but from choice. That evening, Evan suggested a walk. The air around Green Lake was cool, the surface of the water rippling gently beneath the sunset. The same place where I'd once faced my parents now felt like sacred ground. We strolled quietly until he stopped near the pier. You know, he said, sliding his hands into his pockets, you've been building futures for everyone else. Maybe it's time to think about ours. I turned to him, a smile tugging at my lips. Is this your version of a proposal? He shrugged. I'm not very traditional. I just know that wherever you go next, I want to be there. I took his hand. You already are. The lake shimmered behind him, golden light spilling across the water. There was no ring, no audience, no grand gesture, just quiet certainty. That was enough. Later that week, Joanna stopped by my office with a folded newspaper. Small headline on page 8, she said, placing it on my desk. Your brother's firm officially dissolved. Your parents sold the house. I glanced at the photo of the old colonial home, its once perfect hedges now overgrown. For a moment I felt an ache, not of loss, but of finality. Will you visit? Joanna asked. I shook my head. No. Forgiveness isn't about returning to the fire. It's about leaving it behind. She nodded, her expression soft. You've learned faster than most people ever do. That weekend, I hosted a small dinner at home. The apartment glowed, with warmth, candles, flickering laughter, bouncing off the walls. Joanna sat across from Maya, who animatedly described her new internship. Evan poured wine, teasing me about overcooking the pasta. At one point, I looked around the table and realized every person there had once been a stranger, and now they were my family. When the meal ended, I raised my glass. To family, I said, my voice steady but full. Joanna smiled. The one we choose. We clinked glasses, the sound ringing like soft bells. After dinner, I pulled Maya aside and handed her a small box. For you, I said. She opened it to find a delicate silver necklace with a small circular pendant engraved with one word, seen. Maya's eyes filled with tears. You didn't have to, I wanted to, I interrupted gently. Whenever you doubt yourself, remember you've always been visible. To me, to the world, and to yourself. She hugged me tightly. Thank you, Maddie. When everyone left, I stayed by the window looking out at the city glowing under the night sky. I thought about the girl I once was standing outside her parents' house begging to be understood. I wanted to tell her that one day she'd stop begging and start building. Evan came up behind me, draping a blanket over my shoulders. You've built something beautiful, he said softly. I turned, smiling. And it's only the beginning. He kissed my forehead. Then let's keep building. The city shimmered below, alive with light and movement. Somewhere a siren wailed in the distance, but it didn't feel intrusive. It felt like life, messy, imperfect, real. I looked out and whispered, the true family is the one that stays. For a long moment, I just stood there, wrapped in warmth and quiet. Then I added half to myself, half to the world, and I finally stayed for myself. Evan squeezed my hand. That's the only family that matters. The laughter from earlier still echoed faintly through the apartment, a reminder that peace doesn't come from erasing the past, it comes from writing something better over it. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a survivor anymore. I felt like the author of my own story. The new LumoSync creative studio smelled like fresh paint and coffee. Sunlight spilled across the floor, reflecting off glass walls, covered in sketches, plans, and photographs of the foundation's first scholarship recipients. The place hummed with life, young women laughing, typing, creating. The sound was soft and vibrant, like music written in hope. I walked through the open hallway, coffee in hand, stopping to greet one of the new interns, a girl named Lydia. She was showing another team member her prototype for a coding app that translated sign language in real time. Her eyes shone when she noticed me. Miss Hart, look, it works now. I smiled. You made that happen. No, she said. You did. You built this place. I watched her for a moment, realizing how strange it felt to hear that. There had been a time when I wanted the world to see me. Now I just wanted to help others see themselves. Joanna appeared in the doorway, her tablet tucked under her arm. You're not going to believe this, she said. The foundation just got another partnership offer. Amazon wants to fund a mentorship program for young women in AI. I raised my eyebrows. When it rains, it pours. Except this kind of rain will take, she said with a grin. The two of us walked through the building together, past glass-walled meeting rooms filled with laughter and ideas. Everything about this space was the opposite of where my story began. No tension, no cold silences, no competition for love. Just women building a world together. That evening I stood in front of a mirror at the Portland Arts Center adjusting the delicate bracelet on my wrist. The theater behind me buzzed with chatter, the premiere of Maya's first documentary, Rebuilding Light. She had invited me as a guest of honor, though I told her I wanted no spotlight. When the lights dimmed, I found my seat near the back. The screen came to life with images of 3 generations of women, a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter, each breaking a different chain of expectation. When the credits rolled, Maya stepped on stage holding the microphone with trembling hands. "This film exists because someone believed in me," she said, "and because she showed me that family isn't about permission, it's about belief." Applause filled the room. I blinked back tears, realizing how full the circle had become. I was no longer the girl begging to be seen. I was the one seeing others. After the show, Maya found me backstage, her face glowing with pride. "You taught me it's okay to start over," she said, wrapping me in a hug. I smiled. "And you taught me how legacy really works. It keeps moving forward even when we stop looking back." When I returned to my office the next morning, a white envelope sat on my desk, no return address. I opened it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable, my mother's. "We've followed your work. It's beautiful. We're proud of you. And we're sorry we didn't see you sooner." I read it twice, then folded it gently, and placed it in the drawer beside my old journal. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to respond. Not out of bitterness, but because there was nothing left to fix. Some apologies weren't meant to reopen doors, they were meant to close them quietly. That evening, I hosted a small dinner at home. The living room glowed with candlelight plates stacked high, with food laughter filling every corner. Joanna sat at one end of the table, Maya beside her, Evan across from me. The team from the foundation filled the rest of the seats. We clinked glasses, shared stories, teased one another. At one point, Evan raised his glass. "To Maddie," he said, smiling. I shook my head. "No, to all of you. To the family we built." Joanna added, "The kind that chooses to stay." Everyone lifted their glasses. To family. The moment froze in my memory, the warmth, the laughter, the sense of belonging that required no proof, no conditions. After everyone left, I stayed by the window watching the city lights shimmer across the skyline. The night breeze carried the faint smell of rain and jasmine. Evan came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "You okay?" he asked softly. "I am," I said. "Completely." He kissed the top of my head. "You've built something incredible, and it's only the beginning." When he went to bed, I stayed awake a little longer. The apartment was quiet, now filled with the hum of the city outside. I walked to the bookshelf and picked up an old photo frame, the one from my wedding where the front row had been empty. I looked at it for a long time, then replaced it with a newer photo. The foundation team at the Gala Arms, linked smiles wide. My real family. At my desk, I pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began to write. "To the girl who still feels unseen, you don't need permission to shine. Build your life, your peace, your own version of family. And when you do turn around and help someone else rise." I folded the note and placed it into a folder labeled Future Recipients. The stack beside it had grown thick over the past year. Letters from me to women I hadn't met yet, each one carrying a piece of what I'd learned, the hardest way possible, that love built by choice will always outlast love begged for. Outside, dawn began to paint the sky in soft pink and gold. I stood there watching the first light of day touch the tops of the buildings. For so long I'd chased visibility. Now I understood that peace doesn't need to be seen, it just needs to be lived. I turned off the desk lamp, exhaling deeply. The city stretched awake beneath me, alive with movement and promise. If you're still here listening to my story, maybe you felt something of your own in it. Maybe you've been the one who had to walk away from the people who were supposed to love you most. Maybe you've had to start over, build something from nothing, or find your voice again after years of being quiet. If you have, then this story was for you. And maybe now it's your turn. Tell me where you are in your journey. Tell me what family means to you. Because stories like ours don't end, they ripple outward, changing others in ways we can't always see. So if this story touched you, stay a while, leave a comment, share your piece of it. Subscribe if you want to hear the next chapter of someone finding their voice again. After all, that's how healing works together, one story at a time. Outside, the city lights faded into morning. I whispered into the soft glow, I'm home now. And this time, I truly was.